NBC 10 News Conference begins right now.
And good morning, I'm Bill Rappleye. Jack Reed, as I said, is our guest. Thank you for coming in, Senator.
Thank you, Bill.
We're taping this on Friday. It was just yesterday that there was an attack in Paris.
Yes.
ISIS is claiming responsibility. President Trump says it's a terrorist attack. This kind of an incident just while they're undergoing an election, do you think this is going to influence the results of the election?
I think it will have an effect on the election. Many of the candidates last evening ceased their campaigns out of respect to the slain police officer. The elections of this weekend, it's the first round, though. And then they'll have a second round. Two of the many candidates will emerge from this round. And there is a presumption that Marine Le Pen, who is the far-right candidate, would be in the final round. But it's unclear if she can ultimately win the presidency, given the history of her party and their right-wing stances and some of the statements she made in her campaign. But I think there will be an immediate effect. But if this was the final election, it could be decisive. But this is just the first round.
Now, what about the notion that this was an ISIS attack? I mean, clearly there are attacks by people who will want to claim the ISIS ideology who may have no connection at all with the group.
Well, ISIS reflexively takes credit for any incident like this. Sometimes there is a causal connection. The individual might have been monitoring ISIS media sites, or they could even have a much more significant role. But in many cases, it's an individual who's self-radicalized that decides to do something, and ISIS simply jumps on the bandwagon, unfortunately. And these lone wolf attacks are the most difficult to stop. The individual in question, France, had been convicted years ago of assaulting policemen. He had been detained last February because of suspicious behavior. A lot of factors here. He seems to be someone who is a criminal, or at least anti-police.
And the same thing in this country. Do we not have incidents where people get out and murder other innocent people and then yell Allah Akbar, and then it's called a terrorist attack? Well,
we had an terribly unfortunate incident a few days ago in Fresno, California, where an individual attacked and killed 3 other individuals with a weapon. The police determined later, even though he did yell Allah Akbar, that this was not anyway sort of a radical attack or a terrorist attack. The individual was disturbed that he had run-ins with the police before, and that they saw it as a hate crime, really, that he had attacked. He was an African-American. He had attacked 3 white people. So it was more of a hate crime than a terrorist crime, but nevertheless, 3 people were killed, unfortunately.
So is there a danger in characterizing just mentally disturbed people who adopt an ideology or a slogan as they commit their atrocities, that we then pile that into the category of terrorist attacks?
Well, the police are very careful, and the FBI are very careful to do an investigation before they ultimately classify what type of attack this was. So their initial response, and I think it's a very professional one, is to say, obviously we have some indications of, it could be a hate crime, could be a terrorist attack, it could be someone who's deranged, right, and carrying it out. So what I think happens, though, is that there's a characterization by the public and by the media that takes hold before the police actually conclude what the motivation was. And then when it gets into the realm of a terrorist attack, it's important to determine whether this was self-motivated, that this individual had no real contact with anyone, or is it a situation where there were contacts? That's even more troubling, because you have to go after the accomplices.
Right. Well, we get back to during the presidential campaign, one of the big issues for Republicans was that Obama would not say Islamic fascist terrorism or extreme Islamic terrorism. Right. And then yesterday, President Trump said this was a terrorist attack in France, but it may not turn out to have been an organized terrorist.
Yes. No. Again, I think part of this was the recognition that there are elements within the Muslim community that have a antipathy, and that's a mild term for not just the United States, but for Western culture. But there's a vast number of Muslims that are supporting us and helping us. You know, the King of Jordan I visited with a few weeks ago, he's one of our staunchest allies in the region. We're working shoulder to shoulder with Iraqis, military and political leaders who are Muslim. So it's I think we have to be very careful not to alienate the Muslim community here and across the globe, but at the same time we have to identify who's going after us and preempt and disrupt those potential attacks. So it's, you know, wording is important, but I think more important is the facts and going after those who are trying to harm us.
Let's talk a little bit about the attack on the airfield in Syria after the gas attack. You said that was the appropriate response. What should be the next response? Well,
Syria is one of the most complicated issues you can confront. With the Russian involvement, you have not only the possibility of a conflict with the Assad regime, but also with Russia. The Iranians are involved. On our side, we have been trying to develop a resistance, rebels that are, in relative terms, moderate Arabs, not extremists, but there are many extremist groups there that are fighting against the Assad regime. So I think the first strategy is to continue what we were doing previously, which is focus in Syria on ISIS, reduce their headquarters and one of their great centers, both for planning and for operations, Raqqa, reduce that, and then begin to work, I think, only through an international effort to try to not only stabilize the situation in Syria, but one, to lower the level of violence, and then ultimately the goal has to be to move Assad out. But that, I think, will only take place if there's at least some type of acknowledgement or cooperation by the other parties internationally, particularly Russia.
So it was okay for the president to respond to a specific incident with this missile attack. What of those additional steps that you outlined can he take unilaterally without the authorization of Congress?
We are conducting operations, we have been for several years, in Syria, assisting Syrian forces, not fighting directly ourselves, but providing assistance. That is because we're going after ISIS, and that is still under the purview of the authorized use of military force we passed right after 9/11. Many of my colleagues, and they've made very good points, suggest, and I think too, that we have to relook at that authorization. It's now 15 or 16 years. But that is the legal premise for our operations in Syria. We have not, until this attack on the airfield, taken a direct U.S. attack against an asset of the Syrian government, the Assad regime. That was in response, and I think appropriately so, to the use of sarin gas against his own population. And the line that I think the president drew was, we won't, and the international community won't tolerate the use of poison gas against innocent civilians. The next set, though, of issues are much more complicated. How do you finalize the efforts against ISIS, and then how do you ultimately stabilize the situation in Syria and somehow move Assad out and get someone else in who would be much more acceptable to the world community?
We have to take a break.
Yes.
We'll continue our conversation with U.S. Senator Jack Reed after these commercials.